Good afternoon, welcome. You are tuned into the Labor Forum here on WRFG 89.3 FM in what is another wonderful fall day here in this city. And we want to thank all of you who are listening on your radios, perhaps as you're driving home from work, from one of those jobs that was mentioned in the song by John Fromer that always starts our program off. Some of you might be tuned in to WRFG on your computer, and others on the mobile app. And some of you might be watching us live, and you see that we have a guest in the studio sitting between Paul and me. And we will get with our brother Thandabunta Iverson in just a few minutes. But first we want to make sure that you are so totally aware that this is the third and final week of the WRFG Fall Pledge Drive. This is your opportunity to express through a financial contribution how much you appreciate both the quality music, the information analysis that you receive about not just community affairs here in Atlanta, but globally. And in particular, how much you like listening to the Labor Forum every Monday from 4 to 5 here on 89.3 FM. And so I do want to encourage you to take an opportunity either to go online and with a credit card or debit card, make a pledge to WRFG, and if you want to note that it's intended to show a special appreciation for the Labor Forum, you can do that. You also can just send a check to the station here at 1083 Austin Avenue Northeast, and the zip is 30307. I do want to start off the program by acknowledging some donations that the Labor Forum got, and I'm going to ask Christopher to ring the bell as soon as I announce them. And so we have a really nice, sizable contribution from Dewey McLean, president of the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council. Ding, 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 thank you, Dewey. And we have also a pledge and a check from AFSCME Local 1644. Thank you, President Greg Fan and others. And that should encourage you all to throw your dollars in as well. It does cost us a couple $100,000 a year to keep the Labor Forum here on all the programs here at WRFG on air. And we only have been able to do it for over 40 years because of your support. So enough of that. As you know, the opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG, but I want to also assure you that the programs are chosen with care, and the Labor Forum, its topic, that we bring the voices, issues of working people by and for and about them, is part of the mission of WRFG. And that's why this program has been on the air since 1986, when Gary Washington initiated it, and has been holding forth ever since. We're one of the few programs in the United States on the radio that concentrates on working people. Not just talking about them, but having them talk about themselves and what they're interested in and what they're fighting for. So we're going to start with our two segments that we begin the program with, and the first one is Labor Headlines. I have three different stories that I want to tell. On October 23rd, tens of thousands of students, union members, especially teachers, and other ordinary citizens marched in Mexico City, demanding the return of 43 students from a teachers' college who have been disappeared after being arrested by police on September 26th. The kidnapping took place in the state of Guerrero, where drug gang violence and political corruption has destroyed the lives of many working class and poor families. The relationship between the police, elected officials, and drug cartels provides impunity for any and all acts of intimidation and terror. These students attended a teachers' college known for its active support of human rights. Worker and student organizations, along with the students' families, have taken to the street, set up tent cities in front of government buildings, blockaded highways, and burned the city hall in Iguala, where the corrupt mayor and his wife have been linked to the students' disappearance. The search for the young teachers has turned up multiple mass graves, with dozens of bodies of those likely murdered by drug gangs and corrupt police. And that is an ongoing story. It got a little bit of news in the beginning, but what we haven't seen now is the mass response. We've seen the stories about, the horror of it all, but it's important to know that like the response to the killing of Michael Brown here in this country, where it has started a movement, this is the same with these young students who have been disappeared, 43 of them in Mexico. We're going to turn now to some national headlines. As many as 2,000 Uber drivers in New York City refused to pick up passengers this past Wednesday, October 22nd. At least 4 other cities, Santa Monica and San Francisco, California, Chicago, and London, saw similar work stoppages. The high-tech company, which recruits people to use their personal cars to transport others, manages the drivers and passengers through a cell phone app and credit card payment system. This company recently slashed the fares, reducing payments to the drivers to a pittance. Drivers in New York City have formed the Uber Drivers Network to fight against the company policies and are collaborating with the Taxi Cab Drivers Alliance. In California, the workers have formed California App-Based Drivers Association, which is affiliated with the Teamsters Union. And on Thursday, October 23rd, the Better Business Bureau in San Francisco, gave Uber an F for its lack of response to a pattern of complaints. One example was a customer who was charged $407 on his credit card for an 18-mile trip. Uber offers another example of how corporations misclassify workers as so-called independent contractors, then ineligible for a set pay schedule, hours of work, benefits like unemployment or workers' compensation. The Labor Forum will have several future programs on this issue of misclassification of workers, so stay tuned every Monday from 4 to 5. And here in Atlanta, on October 23rd, the Woodruff Arts Center representatives walked out of the talks being facilitated by the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, which was attempting to bring an end to the lockout of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra members. Progress had been made on issues of health benefits and pay. The main problem continues to be the unprecedented power the Arts Center wants to have over the number of musicians, it's called a complement, of the orchestra. It is standard across the country and around the world for this to be a set, agreed-upon number. 95 is the number most acclaimed orchestras have in their, among their members, of which the ASO has long been one. The ASO has won so many Grammys and so many awards with this full complement of musicians. Following the 2012 lockout, the contract set a less than full-time schedule. The musicians lost 10 weeks of pay and a reduction in number to only 88. After retirements and other reasons, including people leaving for better opportunities, the current number is 77. However, management has refused to even commit to that number. These highly skilled musicians say that any further reduction will irreparably harm the quality and the reputation of the symphony and fail to honor the sound of the music. The musicians have put their offer to settle the lockout out on their website. And so to see that, the website address is www.atlsymphonymusicians.com. And that concludes our 3 labor headlines for today around the world. We're going to move next to Paul McLennan, who has been educating all of us on labor history in these several months that he has been co-hosting here on the Labor Forum. And he's got a really fascinating kind of story of a woman that I had never heard of before. And I'm really pleased that you all will be able to get this information as well, because it's quite inspiring.
Thanks, Diane. One of Puerto Rico's most famous labor organizers, Luisa Capetillo, was born in the town of Arecibo on October 28, 1879. She was one of Puerto Rico's best labor organizers at a time when women did not even have the right to vote. Daughter of a domestic servant and a laborer, her parents were drawn together by their shared belief in democratic ideals expressed in the attempted European revolutions of 1848. They educated her at home and encouraged her to have an active and critical mind. Capetillo later described education as the mother of freedom. The U.S. invasion, occupation, and colonization of Puerto Rico, which began in 1898, intensified economic development and enabled the formation of labor unions, which had been illegal under Spanish rule. As a young mother of two, Capetillo began working during the early beginnings of the textile industry in 1900. From there, she became a reader, or lectora, in a tobacco factory. A lector, or lectora, would read aloud passages of the workers' choosing as they made the cigars on the factory floor. Addressing them from a raised platform, Capetillo began the day with news from local and international papers. She then moved on to socialist and anarchist philosophy. After lunch, she read installments of novels, again chosen by the workers. It was also a tradition in the tobacco factories to have open discussions and debates on particular lectures without interrupting the work. It was here that she was introduced to the labor politics and organizations that would become her life's work. Capetillo's first union act was a farm workers' strike with La Federación Libre de Trabajadores, the Free Federation of Labor, in 1901. A skilled and hard-working labor leader, she succeeded in making Arecibo the most unionized town in the country. Luisa traveled Puerto Rico, educating and organizing women. She recognized the connection between labor and women's rights, and in 1908 she made the revolutionary act of asking the FLT to include a policy of women's suffrage in their goals for Puerto Rico. Capetillo's conception of women's freedom went far beyond political rights, encompassing dress, sexual expression, and abolishing the sexual double standard. Through her efforts, a feminist working-class movement developed as a vital and structural part of the labor rights movement. Capetillo was also a writer, and in 1909 she published her collection of essays, as well as the thesis, My Opinion about the Liberties, Rights, and Responsibilities of Women. Luisa was the first woman in Puerto Rico to commit feminist ideas to print, and My Opinion was the first feminist thesis written in Puerto Rico. Luisa clearly outlined in her essays the belief that women should have the right to love whomever they please without obstruction, including marriage. Capetillo made a number of successful trips to the United States to join and organize a transnational community of radical Spanish-speaking cigar workers. She first began in 1912, leaving for New York City, where she organized both Puerto Rican and Cuban workers. After a year of labor, she traveled to Tampa, Florida, and once again became a lectora in the tobacco factories. Before returning to Puerto Rico, she stopped in Cuba to join a sugarcane workers' strike, where she was arrested and deported. Once home, Capetillo continued to organize and participate in workers' strikes, including the massive sugarcane strike of 1916, in which there were over 40,000 participants in 32 municipalities. This strike resulted in an average salary increase of 13%. In the course of her work, she was arrested, clubbed by the police, and beaten by strikebreakers, but she felt intense sympathy for the farm workers. She was instrumental in revolutionizing the role of women in Puerto Rican society. In 1919, she challenged mainstream society by becoming the first woman in Puerto Rico to wear pants in public. Capetillo was sent to jail for what was then considered to be a crime, but the judge later dropped the charges. In that same year, along with other labor activists, she helped pass a minimum wage law in the Puerto Rican legislature. Capetillo lived intensely and was active in the fight for labor rights up to her death in 1922, at the age of 43 from tuberculosis. The amount of travel, work, and participation in the struggle for labor rights she produced is staggering on its own, and even more so when considering the deep social and cultural barriers that existed for a single Puerto Rican woman in the early 1900s. Radical, generous, and a powerful force for change, Capetillo is remembered as an outspoken advocate for women's freedom and workers' rights in Puerto Rico and across the Caribbean and Latin America.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Paul. That was a lot of information. Again, wow. She is a sister that I had never heard of, but very clearly, in that period of time, there were so many other women, here in the United States as well, that were union organizers and activists who get sort of erased out of the history books. So I hope you, listeners, that you really appreciate the amount of research that Paul does to bring us these facts and about people who have actually changed history that we all should know about. So I think we should let you know that there's a possibility that we're going to get a phone call from the action that's taking place in the Capitol as we speak. There was a press conference that was called at 3:45, and an attempt is going to be made by a number of people to deliver a letter to the Secretary of State. His name is Brian Kemp. And if you've been following either television, newspaper, or other radio sources, you know that there's been a long struggle to get some tens of thousands of people who have signed the paperwork to be registered to vote, but yet when they go on their county registry, they don't see their names. And so this is part of the whole issue of voter suppression, which has been magnified in the last several years with all kinds of ID laws and other kinds of requirements to make it harder and harder for people to vote. So there may be an activity taking place right outside of Mr. Kemp's office, or maybe inside it. And if we get a phone call, we'll go ahead and take that because it'll be breaking news. But we're going to go ahead and start our conversation with our guest, who's a friend of Paul's in particular, somebody I've also known for many years, who's passing through town, and we are taking advantage of this opportunity to have him on. So Paul's going to go ahead and introduce our guest, and again, for those who are watching on the live stream, you can see he is a tall guy.
Thanks again, Diane. I'm really honored and grateful that things worked out. Thandabunta Iverson is a longtime activist and educator in the labor movement. He's lived here in Atlanta and been active in many social movements. He more recently taught labor studies at the University of Indiana in Gary for 17 years. And he just returned from a conference in New Orleans that the U.S. Human Rights Network held, dealing with issues in the South and the Gulf Coast in particular. So we're really grateful to have this opportunity to speak with him about the issue of worker rights as human rights. And I don't know where you'd like to start, Thandabunta, but we can just kind of take this conversation where it goes.
If I can just start something a little bit. I think when we were discussing this before about how to introduce this topic, I said that it seems to me that if somebody reads something in the newspaper or something, or somebody's described as a human rights activist, what most people, I think, in the United States think is that this is somebody who's in a country where there's a dictator or a very repressive form of government, and they're dealing with people who've been imprisoned for their political views. And I sort of think that's what the common thought of this term, human rights activist or human rights, means. And I was hoping that we could really talk about how what human rights are all the things that workers both need and, more importantly, that they fight for all the time, on their job, in their communities, around the world. So that's my kind of introduction to perhaps maybe where you want to go with this conversation.
Well, thank you, Diane. And Paul.
You're good.
Okay, gotta get the technical hookup right. Let me first begin by thanking you, Diane, and all the folks here at RFG for the opportunity to work with Paul today. And thank you, Paul, for inviting me. As a matter of fact, I think I'm sitting in the very same chairs that I sat in some time ago when Sister Faye Bellamy was at the controls. Of course, Faye has transitioned now, but that was my entrance back in those days to WRFG. Those were the days of Brother Ebon Dooley as well. Actually one of the people who really got us all started using radio to further educate our people and our class. Actually, Diane, where you started is a perfect place for me to segue into my few brief remarks, because I think the question that you're raising is a question of education and organization. You're absolutely right. Many working class people in the United States, and I always have to tell my students, please remember that most of us in the United States are not middle class, but working class. That always creates a tremendous debate. But nonetheless, I think U.S. Human rights culture has suffered some very damaging blows since the post-World War II period, late 1940s and early 1950s, when there was, in fact, a very vibrant human rights movement being developed. Eleanor Roosevelt certainly is a name that we hear very often as one of the most significant contributors, but that was also a movement to which people like Mary McLeod Bethune, African-American educator and activist, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, many other people contributed to the fight for human rights. But increasingly, after World War II was concluded, what we see historically is that the culture in the United States, particularly as a result of the insidious relationship between segregation and McCarthyism, human rights actually became something that people tended to look at through the lens of the Cold War. And so as a result of the dangers associated with being associated with anything having to do with communism or radical ideas in general, many people who were on the front lines of developing a human rights movement actually felt that tactically they were now being forced at that time to turn their human rights concerns into civil rights concerns. And so that's one of the main reasons why we end up in a country with a history where we always hear about human rights, but those human rights discussions are usually relegated to conversations about other countries. In the United States, the assumption is made that we already have our human rights and that what we really have to press for are civil rights. And I mean, civil rights are a part of human rights, but the whole human rights idea, the ideal of human rights, the ideal that we should have certain rights as a result of just being human beings, just being born, has been turned on its head. And so now today, particularly since we have been experiencing since the late 70s, this terrible agenda of profiteering corporate profiteering, and sometimes we hear people use the term neoliberal to describe this agenda. This agenda has in fact turned many of our day-to-day expectations about what human beings deserve upside down. And so now we have to fight for the notion that people have a human right to health care. Now we have to fight that for the notion that people ought not to be criminalized because they actually do have a right to have housing. Now we have to fight for the right of workers to not only have a union, but to collectively bargain. Now we have to fight for the right to education, particularly in an environment where, and certainly anyone who read the paper, the Atlanta paper this morning, can see that privatization is something that now it's hard to imagine for privatization without also imagining efforts of charter schools to become money makers. And so across the board, given all of the needs that people have these days, I think it's now important, as you were suggesting initially, Dianne, for us to take a page, if possible, from Luisa Picatio, because when we look at her life, we see that she was continuously in struggle for human rights of workers, not only in Puerto Rico and Latin America, but also here in the United States. And we also see that in her personality, she embodied a bold embrace and expression of all aspects of her being, which is precisely at the heart of what it means to recognize our identities as human beings and to recognize that we have to be accepted in all aspects of our beings and not just in those that other people want to regard as comfortable to them. And so I'm just really glad to be here, and I look forward to, given the time that we have, to just being in dialogue with you, because that's one of the reasons why I am a human rights activist. I think that we have to educate and organize and mobilize people to learn to really accept our humanness again and recognize that many of the things that we're told that we have to pay for and fight for should be ours by right of just being born children of God or children of the Creator, if you will.
I wanted to go into this a little bit more because it seems to me that one of the phrases that gets used a lot when we're talking about how here on this program, I say that every issue is a workers' issue. Mm-hmm. And that's because we want to connect all the dots. And that's another phrase that gets used a whole lot. It's called connecting the dots, so that we understand that one thing is not separate and by itself. One issue isn't separate and by itself. It's connected to all these other issues. Mm-hmm. And so it goes back to that there's a common reason why these things happen. There's a common cause. There's a root of it all. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that one of the things, again, that I think about the term human rights struggle or the struggle for human rights is essentially that. It seems to me that if people look at the document, for one, although it's still limited in my opinion because it was written a long time ago.
You mean the
Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes.
But nevertheless, that is a document that has got global adherence to or global understanding of.
Absolutely.
And it lists all these things that we just talked about.
Absolutely.
Right to a decent job and housing and safety and culture and sports and education as the things that every human being on the globe should have. And so I think that is part of what the struggle of workers. Oftentimes it's perceived that a worker's struggle or a union struggle is only for pay or working conditions,
right,
and separate from all the totality of the rest of their life as a family member, as a community member, as anything else. So I was wondering if you could give some examples of, if you have in your experience, where a struggle maybe started out as a one issue or something, but through people's life experience or that of yourself or others, we're able to make a broader connection.
Yes, thank you for, that's a very useful segue, I think. Let me just say this to begin with. During the month of August, there were a number of people who left the United States and went to Geneva, Switzerland. They went to Geneva, Switzerland to participate in a review of the compliance and non-compliance of the United States with an international treaty or agreement that the United States has ratified, not only signed it, but also ratified. This is one of only 2 or 3 of many international agreements that the United States has ratified. This particular document is called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
This might be our, why don't you just go ahead while we find out for sure.
This particular document is very important because it is often referred to as the Race Convention. And many people...
Hold on, we're going to put you on as...
That breaking news.
We do have breaking news. Thank you so much. We're going to come back to this.
All right.
In a flash, hold your thought. So who do we have calling?
Bob.
We have Bob calling in. Okay, Bob, I believe you're on the air. Hi. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. So we know that you're calling from the Capitol, and we know that we've done a little intro about this event that's taking place to oppose the voter suppression. So what is taking place right now?
Well,
I'm sorry, this is Bob Goodman, everybody, from the Georgia Peace and Justice Coalition.
Things began today. We have about, I would say, between 50 and 75 people here. Things began with everybody gathering on the steps at the second floor of the Capitol building, where press conferences are traditionally held. Reverend Timothy Francis of the NAACP, State President of the
Francis
NAACP.
Johnson? You talking about Francis Johnson?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Francis Johnson, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
He gave a brief, fairly about a half-hour talk explaining what the issue was. The issue is that about 40,000 people have registered to vote, but their registrations have not been processed, although some of them registered weeks ago. And the Secretary of State has refused to do anything to expedite the process. So about 15 minutes ago, we all marched down to the Secretary of State's office, and 8 or 10 people have gone inside the office to talk to the Secretary of State. Secretary of State arrived a few minutes ago and went into his private office and shut the door. So it looks as if he's not too eager to talk, but the people who are inside the office are planning to stay there either until he comes out and talks to them or until they are carried off and arrested. And that's what's going on right now.
All right, thanks so much, Bob. Is there anything that folks who are listening might be able to do to support this action? I suppose they could call if they wanted to, see how things are going.
Sure, people could come down here if they'd like and join us at the Capitol. They can send out tweets saying, "Let us vote," if they're on Twitter, and things like that will help us raise this issue around the country. That's what people are doing now.
All right. I thank you so much for calling in. I'm sure it's a kind of hectic there, or maybe a little tense. We very much appreciate you calling in, Bob, to the Labor Forum and letting us know what's going on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, folks, that's the deal with community radio. We are able to do things like that because we're here in the studio and we're not just some recorded voice talking to you all. So we will go back to where, if you can figure out, remember your thought, we were talking about the delegation that went to Geneva.
Yes, we were talking about the delegation that went to Geneva to present and to bear witness to some of the attacks, the numerous attacks, I should say, on racial justice in this country. Such as the murders of Trayvon Martin and also Michael Brown and
the list goes on and on.
And the list goes on and on. This convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination is not simply important just because of race. One of the things that we have to do a much better job of helping people to understand is that there is very specific language within this international document, which not only addresses, not only provides us with a more expansive definition of discrimination than we have in the United States, because increasingly since the 1980s, what we've seen is that if people feel like they're being discriminated against on the basis of race and ethnicity, in workplaces, for example, you have to be able to prove that someone intended to do it.
And you have to document it. You have to have names, dates,
Exactly,
times, places,
exactly.
exact words,
Exactly. And one of the things that we see that...
and a lawyer.
And money for the lawyer, right, yes. One of the things that we see in this document, however, is that rather than talking about, narrowing our understanding of what discrimination is on the basis of whether or not a person intended to discriminate against you or me, what the definition in the U.S. In the UN, in the Human Rights document that we call CERD, tells us is that whatever you do, if it has a disproportionate impact on people of color. In other words, if I experience what you have done, or if I am experiencing what you have done or are doing as a violation of my rights, then that is sufficient for us to change the conversation and not necessarily look at what individuals are doing, but to look at what the structure and the structures and the processes are within which we are working. And so what I want to do right now is just sort of connect, because you had asked me about this, Diane, the very folks who are attacking our rights in Georgia to vote, which is often viewed as a civil and political right. The very folks who are undermining our ability as citizens to have our registrations processed properly and transparently.
And timely.
And timely. Those are the same people who are trying to do all that they can to maintain the vicious attacks on health care, which is an economic, social, and cultural right. They are also the very same people who are undermining our rights to have a union, our rights to have adequate income, our rights to collectively bargain, our rights to have adequate access to affordable health care. So what we see is that when we talk about who is behind the kinds of attacks that we're experiencing in one sphere, we don't have to walk that far to see that those are the very same people in general who are attacking our rights in other spheres. Am I making sense? Okay.
Absolutely.
So there really is, I mean, unfortunately, sometimes to try to make sense of our rights, we narrow the titles and we narrow the way that we talk about this or that category of right. But actually, when the human rights regime was created in the post-World War II period, economic, social, and cultural rights were viewed on a par. They were viewed as equal to economic, social, and cultural rights. And it's because of the selective way in which the U.S. government which certainly promotes the idea that we often talk about as U.S. exceptionalism, that meaning that, we don't really have problems with human rights here. That government is also the one that selects civil and political rights historically as more important than our economic, social, and cultural rights. But it is our economic, social, and cultural rights that we find also being attacked, particularly within this profiteering agenda.
The phrase that Dianne used, connect the dots, another term that we're hearing a lot in the movement in the last few years is intersectionality.
Right.
And one of the things I like that Audre Lorde says that kind of is related to what we've been talking about is that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because people don't live single issue lives.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk about this concept of intersectionality and how people who are oppressed by one form of oppression may also simultaneously be experiencing others, and why this is an important concept for us to merge, I think, with the use of the human rights framework.
Well, as a former, thank you, Paul, for that question, because I think it takes us right back to Dianne's earlier remarks about the kind of education that I think we need in our workplaces and in our communities these days. As a person who used to work at the international of the of SEIU, Service Employees International Union, I can't tell you the number of times when labor struggles have actually been inadvertently, I think, undermined many times, and unfortunately perhaps sometimes intentionally narrowed, if not undermined, by the notion that we could only talk about the economic issues in a workplace. We could not connect those issues with the racial injustices because a lot of times organizers are afraid that if you have a bread and butter issue, so to speak, and that we often call economic issues bread and butter issues, people are often afraid that if you talk about bread and butter issues and you introduce questions of identity, questions of how people are experiencing unequal power relations in the kind of arrangements that we have based on race or gender or sexual orientation, people sometimes shy away from and really just refuse to have these kind of conversations because they're afraid that it will disrupt our effort to get everybody on the same page to fight the economic issue. And what we're learning, I think, slowly but surely, is that there's no way, I mean, if we just take the folks that are in this room right now, if I consider this to be a workplace, there's no way that we could separate Dianne's womanhood from her ability to produce as a worker. And if we start to do that, we inevitably we're going to lose sight of all of her being, and we're going to narrow the struggle so that there are going to be some people like Dianne who are not going to feel like they are totally included in the fight.
Absolutely.
So this question of intersectionality, and I know that's a long word for us to digest, and sometimes I try to stay away from it because it's a word that I use. I'm forced to use certain words sometimes when teaching in the university. They expect you to indicate to people how intelligent you are, but I think the real deal here is that we want to accept, and we want to embrace, and we want to defend every person's dignity as a human being, the total person, not just on the basis of his or her race or sexuality or anything else. I should not have to park part of my being in the vestibule or the coat rack to come into your meeting as a worker. I ought to be able to bring all of who I am, African American, worker, male, hetero, in my case, heterosexual, bald, all of that. I need to bring that in. I'm 67 years old. I ought to be able to bring my total being into this situation and sit down at the table and be a part of building the activities and build those activities of our movement building in such a way that everyone who has a stake in this fight can feel included and have a voice.
There's a segue there that I'm wondering if you can talk about another concept that's used in the U.S. Human Rights Network, and that's building a people-centered movement, and what the concept of people-centered means as opposed to movements that may be led, let's say, by a charismatic leader.
Well, I can go back to the roots of my evolution, if you will, as an activist. I was reared in Columbus, Ohio in the 1950s. And of course, I was actually literally born in the late 1940s on the cusp of the emergence of what we now regard as the civil rights and black power movements. And of course, one of the things that has been characteristic in many places of African American liberation struggles has been that we have tended to often provide space for leadership, but only for those people as individuals who come forward as leaders. And what happens very often, and I've seen this a great deal, is that people become invested in the what this individual says and what this individual does, and a perfect example being Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But then when that person is taken from us, either by sickness or assassination, then those of us who have been following, those of us who have been part of the movement, building the movement, but we have invested our leadership in this one person, we have underdeveloped very often the very people who are experiencing the worst violations. And one of the things that we're seeing now is an effort to shift to a more people-centered way of doing things so that we're focusing on the people who are most affected, making place, providing opportunities for leadership for the vast majority of people who should have the say, so that we don't have a single individual in whom we invest all of the qualities of leadership for the movement.
I was going to say, I think this is true that there's we've had many fast food workers on here, on this program. Last week we had two of the most extraordinary home health care workers on this program. Right. And I think what it shows time and time again is that when people who, as we say, have the most to lose, but also the most to gain.
And to give.
If given that opportunity, are remarkable, and that the qualities of leadership need to be both nurtured and shared. That doesn't mean that there can't be somebody who's the better speaker and there's somebody who's the better this or the better that.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that everybody's better if they all get a chance to take a crack at it.
That's right. That's right. And when you look back at the history of the civil rights movement, for example, I think a very careful assessment would lead us to observe that Dr. King, for all of his speaking ability, for all of his academic prowess, that Dr. King, had it not been for E.D. Nixon and some of the women in Montgomery coming together and basically laying the groundwork for the struggle, Dr. King would probably have remained a minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. But he was new to the city. In a sense, he had not yet been corrupted to become do-nothing preachers, as we sometimes run into in our faith communities. And so E.D. Nixon went to him and said, we want you to be, a part of this movement. And as a result of being part of the movement, he emerged with a certain leadership status. But the movement never was simply represented by him, and he by himself was not the movement.
He did not free people. People freed themselves.
So let's just ask maybe a few questions about, maybe a little bit more about the work of the U.S. Human Rights Network. And because this is a program that's specifically addressing workers' issues, if you could talk, if there's any kind, again, programs or campaigns that start with workers but address the human rights issue in a bigger context with them.
Very good. Let me just go back to the recent review based on an examination of the United States compliance with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. There is specific language within the third document itself that addresses workers' rights. Now, the sad reality is that all too often in conversations about racial justice and the Race Convention, we tend to overlook the very articles that address the economic, social, and cultural rights of workers. And we focus mainly on race, when in fact you can't talk about race in the third document without also talking about economic, social, and cultural rights. With that being said, let me point to the future. In November of 2014, I believe, people will again be going to Geneva. In the process, what they're going to be addressing it's called a universal periodic review. Now, in a short period of time, I'm going to have to talk fast. A universal periodic review is even more significant, perhaps, than a regular review of a country on the basis of those international agreements that country has ratified. A universal periodic review provides an opportunity to look at a government's compliance with all of the human rights statutes and standards in the world, whether they have, as a government, signed on to them, ratified them or not. So consider that in November we have an opportunity to talk about economic, social, and cultural rights that are being attacked in the United States right now. So when you talk about that, you're talking about things like the right to have a union, the right to freely associate and build a union, the right to collectively bargain, rights which we clearly have in Wisconsin and Indiana and Michigan and of course in Georgia. These are all right to work. Sometimes we organizers call them right to starve states. So these are precisely the kinds of human rights, the rights of workers to a union, to collectively bargain, to health care, to education, to adequate standard of living, that allows one to not only take care of himself or herself, but also the people that depend on you. These are all considered economic, social, and cultural rights, and they will be coming up for discussion in Geneva in November. Now, what does that mean to us in Atlanta, or in Gary, Indiana, or in Denver, Colorado? What it means is that we have to document those violations that we find existing in our own local and regional areas so that they can be voiced to the committee in Geneva. But even more importantly, Diane and Paul, it's not so much important. I mean, it is important that people in Geneva speak and offer their recommendations to the U.S. government. But more importantly than that, workers in Atlanta need to have an opportunity to have a hearing about the fact that there are attacks that workers in Atlanta are experiencing even as we speak. So folks who are doing stagehand work in Atlanta, who can't get a contract because Crew 1 refuses to even sit down with them and acknowledge their human right to a union and to collectively bargain. These workers need to have an opportunity to voice what their experiences are and have it documented so that it can be presented not just to Geneva, but to other workers in Atlanta so people understand the gravity and the breadth of these kinds of attacks. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So let's do this real quick. If there's somebody out there who would really be interested in engaging in this process or has an idea about it, how do they reach the U.S. Human Rights Network? And then you've got a little segue out.
Well, I can tell you
you can Google it.
I don't. There's a number. I think Paul's trying to find the U.S. Human Rights Network number that you can call. Barring calling them, you can always go to www.hrnetwork.org. What's the phone
And the
number?
phone number is 404-588-9761.
Well, that about concludes our program today. I want to thank you so much for being here and stopping
I'm sorry I had to
by.
talk so fast. I don't get a chance to be on these shows very often, so knowing how to talk.
Thank you, brother.
I think you did a
Thank
great
you for
job.
having me. Thank you.
I do want to remind our listeners right before we close out that there is another important issue. It's another part of connecting the dots, and there's a program tonight at the Friends Meeting, 701 West Howard, that starts with a light reception at 6:30 and begins at 7. There is a very special expert on autonomous robots. This is this unbelievable phase of Star Wars war time that is fast approaching. He's going to be talking about whether or not robots get to decide who to kill, autonomous robots. This is a very heavy subject, and one that unfortunately in many places this is already taking place.
Yes.
With drones, but now we're moving past even a drone to where the robot itself is, the drone itself is set up to decide who to kill. So that
And the transit union is continuing to try to hold local politicians accountable around the contract it's trying to settle and to keep jobs from being outsourced. And they'll be at the county commission meeting tomorrow on Commerce at the Manuel Maloof building at 8:30.
So these are two of ways that listeners, you are able to take action around and help connect some dots here in Atlanta. This is Dianne Mathiowetz
Thank you, Diane.
and Paul, and our
let me just
guests.
say, let me just say goodbye to folks and keep on struggling.
All right, thank you. Please tune in again next week, and you are tuned in to WRFG 89.3 in Atlanta. And thank you so much. And now it's time for Democracy Now!